we'll go ahead and start with our opening business. We need to make a statement regarding our electronic meeting as authorized by Utah Code 52-4. This meeting is being held electronically without an anchor location to reduce the risk to health and safety from COVID-19 by limiting the frequency of in-person meetings. So we need to go ahead and move on to the second item on our agenda, which is approval of the meeting minutes. Hopefully you were able to see those.
So moved.
Thank you. We have a motion by Vice Chair Belknap that the board,
Board Member Booth.
Oh, and a second by Board Member Booth. Thank you. That the board approved the minutes of its January 28th, 2021 meeting. We are going to try the check marks. There has been an update in Zoom. We'll see how it works. Everyone may not have updated their devices. So we'll try it one time and see how it goes. All those in favor, please mark the green check mark or a red X.
The voting was unanimous.
It is unanimous, but the marks are not staying longer than 10 seconds. So I think for the rest of the meeting, we'll proceed with a roll call vote until everybody updates devices in Zoom.
Vice Chair Davis, this is Lorraine. I just need to know who was absent for that vote, since I know we still don't have everyone here.
Yes, I will let you know. It was Board Member Cannon, Board Member Earl, Board Member Hanson, Chair Huntsman, and Board Member Lear.
I see Board Member Earl's name. Was she here for the vote? I think she may have joined.
No, she was not.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I was.
Well, Jenny, you didn't put your check up.
I
though.
did put it up. Are
Okay.
you looking for the agenda or for our minutes?
Yes.
Thank
Yes,
you,
I-
Jenny. Thank you.
Sorry.
So Board Member Earl is a yes on that, Lorraine.
Got it, thank you.
Thank you. We'll move on to our next agenda item for discussion and review of legislation. And we'll start with information and a review of bills with Deputy Superintendent Angie Stallings.
Good afternoon, board members. This is Angie Stallings, Deputy Superintendent of Policy with USBE. You may remember last week that we had a discussion of SB 131. That bill is titled Public Education Building Standards and Process. There is a first substitute that has been adopted and that I will describe. So that will be the first bill that we'll speak to is SB 131. So the bill does require LEAs to provide additional information to us at the board, and it will require us to provide guidelines and a list of the lowest and highest costs facilities in the state. I have received some feedback from school district representatives that feedback is they worry that it could increase costs of buildings as they are required to coordinate with municipalities as well as provide a lot of this additional information. So I just wanted to share with you or kind of give you that background again on SB 131, even though we did discuss it last week. I didn't know if the board wanted to ask any questions today about the bill, into more details, and I'm happy to answer questions. Otherwise, we can move to the next bill.
So are you just giving us a summary and then we'll come back to what our views are on this later?
Correct.
Okay.
That is, so at this point, this portion of the meeting will summarize, kind of go through the bills and answer any questions you have about the specific bill. And then after the budget discussion, there will be a time where Vice Chair Davis will facilitate and open it up for board members to
Okay,
make motions for amendments or positions on bills.
okay. So I do have a question, and I'm not sure you'll be able to answer this, but I've also talked to different entities, but I did notice that USBA is opposing it. And, but I've noticed the charter schools are they're supporting it. Is there any reasons why the feelings are so strong from the traditional public schools versus the charter schools? Is there a reason behind that?
So I can try to answer that, Board Member Straight. And if Deputy Superintendent Jones or Matt Barrett are available, they may be able to speak to it, as well as if we have anyone from representing USBA that wants to speak to it, they may also be able to provide additional information. But my understanding is the building construction practices of charter schools and school districts are different. And although globally not the same for all charter schools, there are charter schools, especially larger charter school systems that have multiple campuses, where they might be undertaking a building or a facility construction after they are a charter school. Many, if not, I don't know, maybe 85 to 90% of our charter school buildings are actually built before the charter school is officially a charter school. So oftentimes the charter school is leasing a building, for example, and so they wouldn't necessarily have the same requirement to identify, have the plans for multiple buildings, because oftentimes a charter school is one school building, and the building is either constructed often before the charter school is in existence, or the building is built by somebody else, like a third party, and the charter school is leasing. So I could see that the impact of this bill will likely impact school districts on a much higher level than charter schools, but I can't say that is universal, because you may remember last week, as an example, we had Beehive Science and Technology Charter School come before us, and they are an already existing charter school who's working on a satellite campus. And so I would imagine that as that school that is in existence is working to build a building, they would also have to undertake and work through these same procedures. So so there may be others that could add some additional context, but that is what I'm guessing, is that a lot of these buildings are actually built by third parties or before the school is officially a charter school or opens. Vice Chair Davis, I don't know if Board Member Hymas has something to add, or it looks like he has his hand raised.
Thank you. Board Member Hymas.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, and it could be a quick answer, but what is the local school board? Do they have their hands in this, and how much? If the USBE wants to stay out, or the USBA says we don't support this, do they have any say on how these buildings are built, or how much money is put into these buildings?
Yes, my understanding is that is all right now under local control, and that they would still have the authority to do that, but they would now be required to provide an annual report to USBE. That's not currently occurring. They'd also need to start working with their municipalities, which I'm guessing they do. And again, I am not an expert on building construction, so some of these questions might be best answered by somebody from USBA or USSA, but I do, I know that they have stated they feel that this is going to require more of a reporting burden, that some of the elements of what are being required here are found in different reports currently. So it would require them to create kind of a new report with what they believe are elements that are already available in existing reports. It will also, of course, have USBE staff engaging in something that we aren't currently doing. So we'll be adding to our duties and overseeing or receiving this information. So it does add reporting requirements.
Can I follow up just quickly?
Please.
To me, and obviously some legislatures, there's a clear problem with spending on school buildings. Would this be better directed then at the USBA to say, you probably should work with Senator Harper and work something out? Or is this something, I'm just wondering how much the USBE needs to get involved if educational entities are saying, we don't want to have anything to do with this, but the legislature is saying, well, something needs to happen. In your experience, has that conversation happened between those two? Is there a reason why it has to come here at this level, or you know what I mean?
No, I think that's a good point. I do think that the USBA and USSA and others have been discussing with Senator Harper. So I acknowledge that. I think those conversations are happening, and I'm sure they helped influence the first substitute. So I think that your question is maybe more for the board as to what our involvement is, but I guess I just wanted to acknowledge that I do believe the locals are speaking with Senator Harper directly.
Thank you.
Thank you. Board Member Hart.
I just find this bill to be extremely problematic under the philosophy of local control. And I don't understand why we would support something that increases both reporting requirements and potentially costs from the LEAs and get in their business. I respect Senator Harp's position, but I'm not sure if that's needs a legislative response as much as that needs to stay in the communities where the communities are deciding how to spend those funds. I don't understand where this is a needed legislative response, which I think Board Member Hymas, that's where you're wondering why we would even want to be in this space when both sides of the table say that this would be problematic. I fail to see the benefit.
Cindy, you're on mute.
Thank you. Board Member Straight.
Yes, I just wanted to say that I have a whole lot to say about this, but I would rather move on and come back to the debate later. There's been some really good comments, and I'm anxious and ready to go after it, but I'm going to wait. So can we move on with this part of the meeting?
Yes, and there will be time for motions and discussion at the end of this meeting. So seeing no other hands, go ahead, Deputy Superintendent Stallings.
Thank you. I believe the next bill that we're going to discuss is SB 184, School Assessment and Accountability Amendments. This bill is a bill that we requested. You may remember that the APAC advice, so the Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee, studied over this last year the impact of the pause in assessments that we had last spring, and also made recommendations to the board about kind of two things in general. Number one, whether we should move forward with state assessments for the 2020-21 school year. As you'll remember, the recommendation from APAC is that we do move forward and continue with assessments. The second portion of the recommendations that came from APAC were that the board seek relief from the legislature and government on accountability for any accountability elements that are tied to assessment for the 2020-21 school year. So this bill, SB 184, is a bill that we worked on with Senator Reeby, related to those recommendations that the board supported, I want to say back in maybe October or November. So what the bill would do, and you can kind of scroll down, Jeff, is it would do essentially three things. It does suspend and or make sure that the board is not required to identify schools for the 2021 school year under our rating system for school grades, as well as our school report card, that we would not report those elements related to assessment, student performance on the assessments this year. The other thing it does is more towards the end of the bill. You may remember that the Teacher and Student Success Act requires LEAs to review the performance of their schools, and they either have to be essentially an A or B school or have made a % increase in their performance. And if they don't, then the district is generally districts, but there are some charter schools who have multiple schools as well, would then review the TSSA plans of their schools. And if they have not performed well, the board is supposed to interject or kind of look into those plans and maybe provide less flexibility to those schools. So we're saying that this year they also would not be required to do that, and allow so that the schools wouldn't be penalized based on this year's assessment. So the short story for this bill is it's a 1 year pause in accountability, or a pause in accountability for anything related to the 2020-21 school year assessments. And I believe hopefully Darren Nielsen, Assistant Superintendent of Student Achievement, is available because he has more detail and he'd probably be able to answer specific questions as well. And I'm happy to answer questions.
You're on mute, Vice Chair.
Board Member Earl.
Yeah, Angie, I just have a couple of questions. Maybe either you or Darren can answer those. I'm not sure, but while I'm appreciative that we're doing this, the schools can still have access to that data. Is that accurate, so that they can make key decisions, right? We're just not publishing those. Is that an accurate statement?
Absolutely. The schools will still have access to all of the data. And that is actually one of the reasons why APAC and others have recommended we move forward with assessments, so that the schools will be able to see how students are doing. But yes, so we'll have access to the data as well as LEAs. We just will not publish it publicly.
So one other question along that lines, our schools that are in turnaround, if they have other measurement tools that they've been using, would they be able to use those? We're actually saying that they've got to wait another year to get out. Is that also an accurate analysis, that they're going to have to wait longer to get out of turnaround?
Well, actually, so this last year, you remember that the board adopted updated requirements in our board rule, and we actually have exit criteria for schools in years where we have assessment anomalies. And I believe that this would qualify again, because we don't have student growth. So currently, low performing schools, or the way that a school is identified or a way that a school is exited, is based on our accountability system. But because our accountability system so heavily relies on student growth, and because now we won't have 2 years of data, my assumption is, and I'd be happy to be corrected by anyone on staff if I'm wrong, is that we will rely on the system that was just codified in board rule about how we'll have the panel that will review the school's performance and use that criteria to allow schools to exit, just like we did this last year. But
okay, I just wanted to make sure there wasn't a hampering here of that we were able to still do that. So thank you for the clarification.
Thank you, Board Member Earl. Seeing no other hands, Angie, please continue.
You're on mute.
Thank you. I apologize for that. The next bill is HB 340, Mathematics and Science Opportunities for Students and Teachers Program. This is another bill that we requested. The bill, as you'll remember, this program historically was called U-Star. And then last session, there was legislation that kind of reworked the program based on some audit findings, and we rebranded it to the MOST program, or the Mathematics and Science Opportunities for Students and Teachers Program. Last spring, the bill, not only the funding was cut, but the full program was cut. And the board at the time did not, first of all, we weren't aware when that occurred, but then we have been advocating for reinstatement of the program. So this is one of our policy requests, that we reinstate the MOST program. It does have a fiscal note of $4 million, which is down from the amount that was appropriated at the end of the 2020 session. But this bill would reinstate the MOST program, as well as reinstate $4 million to support the program.
Thank you. Seeing no hands, let's continue.
Okay, the next bill is first substitute, HB 124. And you'll want to make sure, Jeff, when you pull this up, to grab the substitute, because it has not, I don't believe it's been adopted yet. The first substitute is very different than the original bill. You'll remember that recently, just a couple weeks ago, I believe, we as staff brought to your attention the issue of an update to the naturalization, federal naturalization exam. And it used to be that that exam was had 100 questions. It now has approximately, I want to say, 127 questions. And it could, as the federal government updates that United States Citizenship and Immigration Services exam, they may, it could end up being 150 questions or 80. So our recommendation was to eliminate the reference to the 100. That is the only change in this bill. And so Representative Johnson has agreed to run this substitute to make that change. So again, this is something that we as staff and the board supported us seeking this change. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Seeing no hands, let's move on. Oh, sorry, Board Member Earl. I have to switch through 3 different screens to catch
I
everything.
know, it's okay. So my question is, so it's removing, I'm looking at the sub and it's deleting text. Just help me, maybe this is just one of those things I just don't know about legislation yet, but it's removing one section of the legislation that it's referred to, and it's putting it in another section. Is that accurate?
That is correct. So the original bill had a totally different section of code in it related to existing pilot program that was codified or enacted during the 2020 session. And you may remember that the original bill just wanted to change the date of the enactment or the beginning of that pilot program. I think that Representative Johnson has just decided to abandon that bill because the pilot program is already in existence, and because it wasn't funded last year, as long as it doesn't have funding, really the pilot program, can't move forward. So at this point, whether that pilot program moves forward or not is an issue of funding. And so that is not in the bill anymore. It's not in the first substitute. The first substitute only has the section on the American, and can you scroll up a little bit, Jeff, the name of the program? It's like the American Civics Education Initiative. That's the only section in the substitute now.
So it removes it from our civics and character education section of law to, and I don't know what 53E 4205 is. It moves it to that section. Is that accurate?
It doesn't move. So it just doesn't address the civics pilot program at all.
Okay, okay,
So
I
that
see.
section that was in the first bill is no longer in this bill. Now the bill only amends the American Civics Education Initiative.
Okay, I was trying to understand that, and thank you. That may be just trying to understand the legislative functioning of things, so I appreciate it.
Thank
Point of
you.
order,
Board
Chair.
Member Lear?
Point of order.
Yes.
I just would like to remind everybody that speaking directly to staff is not Robert's rules, needs to go through the chair before it goes to staff. Thank you.
My apologies, Chair.
And my apologies, because this is still new to me, so I'm learning as well. Board Member Lear.
Thanks. I just had a couple of questions. Angie mentioned that the test had been revised, and I wondered two things. One, one thing related to that. Are the questions are they improved? Have you looked at them? I understood to begin with that the questions were so basic as to be sort of meaningless for students, but maybe you can, that adds a connotation. But Angie, have they been revised? Oh, I'm sorry. Chair, can I ask?
Yes.
Can we ask the staff to respond?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, I'd be happy to answer. And I honestly have not reviewed the questions, Board Member Lear. So if Robert Austin were available, but I don't believe, I don't know if he's in attendance today. He has reviewed the questions and could probably give you more information on that. But yeah, the only effect of this bill would be to just eliminate that reference to 100. So I can't really speak to the quality of the questions.
And Chair, that's fine from my perspective. I just was curious, and I can check with Robert Austin. And let me just say that I'm sort of disappointed that we couldn't go to something more creative and more, I think that would be more meaningful for students than this required test. So I know that there was significant pushback for the sponsor, and I appreciate his effort, but I hope someday in the next 3 years, we can maybe go to something that could be really a meaningful civics project for a student, however it's characterized. So thank you for letting me make that comment.
Thank you. Board Member Earl.
Yes, Chair, you can easily go see the questions, new and old. They're part of the citizenship, becoming a citizen. You can just look it up and go read those. It's easy to access, so.
Thank you. Seeing no other hands, let's continue.
All right, thank you. The next bill that we're going to review is SB 75. The title is Special Education Least Restrictive Requirement Amendments. This bill adds some new definitions to the state code, including codifying the definition of least restrictive from the CFR, adding definitions of special education services and specially designed instruction. It also includes language that states an LEA may provide special education services to an eligible student in a regular education classroom, regardless of whether the other students in the regular education classroom are eligible students, as well as creating some additional requirements and around the use of special education funds. Just a couple of things I would just bring to your attention as we reviewed SB 175 is that it will create two standards essentially for special education funds, meaning there will be a state standard for funds and a federal standard for funds, which could create some confusion with our LEAs if they somehow rely on the state requirements or the state standards and assume that if they follow the state standards that they will be in compliance with the federal requirements, which will not be the case. This bill would distinguish or change those standards significantly. And so something to consider is how that is a little bit, or if not completely, opposite of what the board has been advocating for since 2019 with, and we're working on with Representative Snow and in that education monitoring and funds management draft bill, is this desire to somehow align our state monitoring as well as, and in this case, it's more specific to funds usage. But the more that we have different standards between our federal and our state programs, it gets to be more difficult for LEAs to comply as well as for our monitors to identify. The other thing it appears to do is the bill seems to provide the availability or ability for LEAs to use state special education funds to fund general ed teachers or services. That appears to be the main intent of the bill, which is not allowed under the federal, with the federal programs. And there are some other issues or things that we've brought to the sponsor's attention as staff of things that could create confusion or contradict with federal law, but I don't want to necessarily take the board's time going over all of that. But I'd be happy to answer questions about this bill.
Thank you. Board Member Lear.
Thank you. Chair, could we ask through the chair, Deputy Stallings and or Assistant Superintendent Leah Voorhees? I want to just make sure I'm understanding what Deputy Stallings is saying. So there'd be one standard for LEAs in spending state money per this bill and a different standard for spending federal money per IDEA. Is that what you're saying? Is that what the Deputy Superintendent is saying?
Can you answer that?
Okay, thank you. Yes. So, and Assistant Superintendent Voorhees could probably speak more eloquently and specifically to it, but my understanding is currently federal funds can only be used for specially designed instruction or for services that are in addition to the general ed classroom. And so this bill seems to want to acknowledge or have a different standard for the state special ed funds and allow state special education funds to fund the general education classroom. And so, and Leah Voorhees may want to add or correct anything I stated.
So I have a follow-up, Chair, if I can.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering if the board's ability still to make rules would allow the board to then qualify the definitions in this rule to meet the federal standards. And that's sort of a rule writing question for Deputy Stallings.
Yes, Chair, may I answer?
Yes, please.
So there are, and Jeff, I don't know if you can scroll up to the top and get to the definition section. We wouldn't be able to amend the definitions that are explicitly in there already unless we were to say, in addition to what is stated here, the definition also includes, we might in some cases be able to add to that, but if we altered the intent of those definitions, we could be called up, by the Administrative Rules Review Committee Chair, who happens to be the sponsor of this bill, for doing that. So, there's always kind of a balance on one hand, the board has quite extensive authority with respect to rule writing, especially in areas like special ed, where the board has been given explicit authority to establish standards on special ed, but we wouldn't be able to contradict or somehow write in a rule something that would conflict with what's in this bill. So there are some terms below, like incidental benefit. I believe there's a couple of other terms that aren't defined that we could possibly define, but the ones that you see here, if the board would like to see some changes to the rule, or I apologize, to the statute or the bill, we could make some recommendations that way as well.
And Chair, one more brief follow-up. I'm sorry, but I just want to make sure I
Really
understand.
fast.
Um, Sort of, I heard Deputy Stallings say it would conflict with the intent of this bill. Is that what she meant, or did she mean to say, because as I read it, I'm thinking it doesn't necessarily, I don't believe it conflicts with the words of the bill. And I'm just asking if she meant to say intent, or if she believes it does conflict with the words of the bill, and I should read more carefully.
Vice Chair, can I answer?
Yes, please.
No, you're right. As far as your authority as a board to create definitions or additional requirements in board rule, it is about the actual words, not the intent. I guess maybe why I said intent is that I imagine that the sponsor of this bill, who also happens to be the chair of the Administrative Rules Review Committee, might be watching what the board will do with this afterwards. My understanding from those who've been working on this bill is that in a lot of ways, this bill is in response to the work the board did this summer primarily, but really it was about a year's worth of work or more by staff to update the special education rules manual. So I do think that this bill is intending to maybe codify some things in code that are different than the way the board addressed it in our board rules, if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah,
We'll go to,
I have a couple more questions. I
Can
have
I
a
come
couple more questions,
back?
but maybe I'll
I'll
please.
come back to you. We're going to hear from Board Member Hart and then welcome back Chair Huntsman, but Board Member Hart, go ahead.
Yeah, I have several questions about this bill. As a practitioner, this bill dangerously changes the role of the IEP committee in making decisions and shifts much of the decision-making, or it appears to the LEAs, which is not something that you can mess with IDEA. In fact, several of these things are very much opposite of our current understanding of IDEA. I'm wondering, is that something that's been discussed among staff? Is that, am I reading something wrong? Any thoughts on that? First of all, it leads into my next question. So I just want to make sure I'm headed, that I understand the bill as it's written. Is there any response to that shift from an IEP team to an LEA decision-making body?
Please answer.
Yes, thank you. Yes, you're correct. And we've actually shared that feedback with the sponsor that under federal law, it's the IEP team who develops the IEP and determines the services that are necessary for the student and not the LEA. So that you are not reading it incorrect. You're absolutely right. And we've shared that feedback with the sponsor that have also identified that as a concern or a conflict with what federal law provides.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead with your follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'm trying to understand, and it goes back to what was said about two separate then special education funding streams that would then require two different auditing procedures, correct? And so wouldn't, and I'm trying to wrap my head around how this would be implemented, how this wouldn't put our LEAs, especially our small LEAs and charters, in an absolutely tenuous position and having to navigate between the federal and the state rules of special ed. Have we not learned that that's a precarious position for our LEAs?
So
I don't know.
Yes, please answer.
Yes, we've also shared those same concerns with the sponsor about the impact of what LEAs will have to do to kind of carefully separate their funds, whether and again, Assistant Superintendent Voorhees and/or Scott Jones, Deputy Superintendent Jones, because fiscal monitors would be in play. But I asked the same question: would they have some classrooms be funded by state funds and some classrooms be funded by federal, or would they have some IEPs be funded by federal and state? Because you're right, it really will require LEAs to carefully monitor and make sure that the state funds are being used for the purposes that are allowed under the bill, because federal funds would not be you would not be able to use those federal funds for these purposes. So they'd have to have really good accounting processes and ability to show that if and when it came time to be monitored or audited.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Huntsman.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to speak a little bit to this bill, but I do have I agree with all of the concerns that have been shared, but my biggest concern is what seems to be, help me understand if this is relevant or if and so this would be a question for staff. The way I'm seeing this is actually, and I don't know a better way to say this, but this is basically a way to take special ed funds. We already have the special ed student is already, there's within the formulas and everything, they're already built into the WPU, a piece for general ed. And then in addition, with the special ed funding add-ons, there's special services that have to happen. And now they want to take that special service, this bill wants to take that special services funding, take it and put it back into the classroom. And so I'm sitting there going, well, it's a double dip. It's I don't know a better term. I'm searching for words. It just doesn't seem ethical that you're already paying for it once and now you're getting it again. And then the nightmare of the management piece it's unreal, but I think it's got a lot of red flags for me is the full intent of this bill. I see the biggest part of this intent, and you read it talks from line 50 down to 64 is I want to put my special ed student back in the classroom, and I don't want to give them the special education services that I normally have to give. And I want to take that money and invest it into a classroom or administration or whatever. Am I speaking out of context here? Any staff member, chair, I would like to get a response. Am I seeing it wrong?
Deputy Superintendent Stallings, would you or someone else be?
I don't know if Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones or Assistant Superintendent Leah Voorhees would like to say anything, but I mean, I think your point, looks like Leah would like to speak.
Please, yes. Is it?
Oh, thank you, Vice Chair. Leah Voorhees, Assistant Superintendent of Student Support. Would you like me to respond?
Please.
Chair Huntsman, that is also our concern and the concern that we have discussed as staff and shared with the sponsor. So yes, I agree with the way that you have conceptualized that issue. And I do want to add that when IDEA provides a dispute resolution process, the IEP is a consensus building process. It's not a vote. It's not we do everything that parents want or the LEA gets to choose as Board Member Hart articulated. It's a consensus building process. And when there is not consensus, and there almost always is, but when there is not consensus, then the IDEA provides dispute resolution. There's a complaint investigation, a neutral third-party complaint investigation process, and a neutral third-party due process hearing available. And in both of those cases, and another concern that we have about this particular bill is complaint investigators and due process hearing officers will rule on allegations based on IDEA, not based on state statute. So in the case of having a parent being concerned about services that are paid with state funds or federal funds, parents have no idea which kind of funds are paying for the services. If they file a complaint or request a due process hearing, the decision will be made based on federal IEP implementation.
Thank you. Board Member Straight?
Yes, my question is there a specific issue or problem that the sponsor is trying to address with this bill? Because I'm really struggling with that.
Would one of you like to answer?
I can try, and I have not yet had an opportunity to speak directly with the sponsor, but I believe that he doesn't necessarily want the federal funds and the requirements that are related to federal special education funds to dictate how state funds are used. I believe that is a core principle or something he believes in. The other thing I believe is that they're wanting to provide more flexibility for LEAs to use the state funds. But then there's this conflict, as I think we've already addressed, that IEP teams are the ones who dictate what services are needed and not LEAs, which is kind of a fundamental principle of special education. And so providing LEAs more flexibility with state funds and giving them that they have more flexibility with the funds, it somehow can have send a wrong message, because when you have to consider that it's really the IEP that determines what services are to be provided. And so whether or not the state funds, whatever's funding it, what restrictions or flexibility they have, really what's controlling is the IEP and not how funds can be used. So it creates this disconnect in ways where, although the funds may be used a certain way, the IEP still dictates how that's used. And again, Assistant Superintendent Voorhees could maybe add to that.
Thank you. Board Member Moss, and also I didn't know, Assistant Superintendent Voorhees, if you wanted to add to that, or if you want to wait and hear the next one and maybe address both, depending what comes up.
Shall I go ahead, or Superintendent Voorhees, did you want to speak first?
Angie did a good job,
Okay.
Vice Chair, so I will wait. Thank you.
Okay. Board Member Moss.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the explanation. I'm trying to understand the difference here between the state and federal standards. And I understand, as I'm trying to parse through the language here, 55 to 64, that the general idea seems to be that if the IEP provides for it, then the student can receive services in a general education classroom, and that would not violate state law if those services provided also gave an incidental benefit to other students who don't have an IEP. At least if I'm reading that right, it does seem to tie it to the IEP and requires special services to be provided, but it can be done in that context. Could you explain the federal take on that? And I apologize if that's something I should know, but if an IEP says this student would be best in a general education classroom, and that teacher providing those special services should do so in that context, despite the fact that that also might have some incidental benefit. Would that be precluded under federal law? Is that where the tension is that we've been addressing here, that that's not kosher under federal requirements?
Assistant Superintendent Voorhees, it sounds like that's a two-part question. So can you address the assignment to the LRE as per the IEP team, or, Board Member Moss's question, and then also the incidental benefit portion of the question and how this would change what incidental benefit is currently like in federal or state law?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Thank you. Again, Assistant Superintendent Lee Voorhees. We actually encourage, data demonstrates that when students with disabilities receive core instruction from a content expert in the general education core curriculum with their non-disabled peers, their outcomes are actually better. So IEP teams determine where students receive their services. There are 5 options, and IEP teams need to examine the services and supports that the student needs, and then determine which of those 5 options the services and supports can be delivered, and they need to choose the one that is the least restrictive, meaning the closest to their non-disabled peers. That's what we want to happen. That's not just what the law says, but that's what evidence and research actually bears out is best for students. We want that to happen. The key is that just placing a student into general education does not meet that criteria. The IEP determines that the student needs specific services, specially designed and individualized, to be able to help them access that general education curriculum and make progress in that general education curriculum. So simply placing the student in general education is not good enough. That does not meet the requirements of the IDEA, of the IEP. Placing the student in general education, if the IEP team determines that that's appropriate, and in addition, receiving the extra services and supports that they need, 30 minutes of reading instruction, 20 minutes of behavior support from a credentialed provider. So someone who has a special ed degree, someone who's a related service provider, like a speech language pathologist, occupational therapist, physical therapist, or someone who is trained and supervised by someone who is credentialed. So it could be a paraprofessional trained and supervised by the special education teacher or the SLP, will be the compliant practice that evidence and the law shows helps students with disabilities access and make progress in the curriculum. That can happen by having the credentialed or the person who's trained and supervised by the credentialed person come in to the general education class and provide those services. It can happen by having that person teach with the content expert. We call that co-teaching, 2 teachers in the classroom. And it can happen by having that student receive core instruction and then leave the classroom for the amount of time that is required on the IEP to receive that specially designed, individualized instruction. There are lots of different models in which that can happen. So that's the first question. Yes, the IEP team determines where the services happen, how close to non-disabled peers, but the services have to be provided. You can't just simply say, okay, the IEP team said that the student can be in general ed, so the student just sits there. That's what happened 40 years ago, and it wasn't working. That's why we have IDEA. Students didn't access and make progress in the core, just sitting there without receiving that individualized, specially designed instruction. So that's question 1. Question 2 is how to pay for it. So a federal law allows federal funds to be paid for all of those specially designed individual services. The general education teacher, that content expert, cannot be paid with the federal funds. The special education teacher or the SLP that comes in, or the co-teacher If there are two teachers, if the special ed teacher is teaching with the general ed teacher, that teacher can be paid with federal funds, or the paraeducator who's trained and supervised by a credential staff can be paid with federal funds. Just a paraeducator that's helping all the students in the class, that isn't just providing the instruction to the students that have an IEP, cannot be paid with federal funds. And this would allow that paraeducator to be paid with the federal funds, or the general educator, who is the content expert, to be paid with, or excuse me, not federal funds, state funds, and the general educator to be paid with state funds. And that's the difference in the funding. Does that begin to answer the question?
Chair, if I could.
Yes, follow up, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just not sure. And I'll confess, I'm reading the specific language for the first time in this review, but I'm not sure how this bill authorizes payment to a general teacher as opposed to a teacher specifically identified in the IEP governed by the IDEA to provide those special education services that are defined in the IEP, but do that in a general classroom. And maybe that's my lack of knowledge about these terms, but I'm having trouble just seeing how this detaches from those IDEA requirements as defined through that IEP process. If special education services are those services mandated by IDEA, and that teacher who is presumably, I don't see where it disregards the requirements of that teacher's background, certification, et cetera. If that teacher is doing it in a general education classroom, I don't quite see how this changes who can provide the services as opposed to where, and maybe I'm not missing the significance of the incidental benefit, where if providing those services, at least at the general sense of that term, I would understand to be if providing those services to the IEP student happens to also benefit others, that doesn't disallow the funding. But am I reading that wrong? And I'm sorry to belabor this, but it seems like an important question. I'm not quite sure how this bill disregards that principle that you were talking about.
Please answer. Dr. Voorhees. Or Deputy Superintendent Stallings, either one.
I could take a stab at it. This is, and then Leah can correct me if I'm wrong. If you go down to lines 123 through 130, and Jeff, maybe you could scroll down to that section. It talks about an LEA may use state special education funds too, and it provides the elements. It does, one thing that we have heard from people in the field, a concern is that for example, the provision on 129 through 130 about employing staff necessary to provide special education services or specially designed instruction doesn't seem to indicate that the staff would have to be credentialed, or as Leah spoke to a moment ago, the difference between a special educator versus a general ed teacher who might not have those qualifications, or a paraprofessional who's not trained. So I know that's one place where it's it kind of seems to give that permissive, LEAs may use the funds to employ staff without stating that and again, the provisions there are all ors, they're not ands. And maybe with some additional language of an and, or in accordance with the IEP, or some nod to the certification or the staff being appropriately credentialed. Because I think that goes to what was stated before, which is the intent. Right now, the words look like the intent is to say the funds could be used for a general ed, to pay the salary of a general ed teacher, which isn't currently the case. But Leah, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Vice Chair,
Yes.
I don't actually need to add. I think that is the concern. You do have to move down in the bill to the lack of credentialing and or training and supervision by a credentialed staff to put those two pieces together.
Thank you. Board Member Hymas?
Yeah, I guess kind of on top of that, we talked about credentialed instruction. So and we also talk about a least restrictive environment. I'm just asking for clarification here. If a student, if let's say I have an IEP student and they're placed into a general ed class, a least restrictive environment, I then need a paraprofessional or a special educator to follow my student from class to class, make sure that they're getting the needs that they are told that they have. And then I guess on top of that, is that in actuality a least restrictive environment? Maybe I'm misunderstanding here what's happening. I don't see this bill. I know it's been said a couple times, just kind of putting the IEP student in a general ed classroom. I don't see where this bill does that. I see some good things in this bill. I see some things that, as Board Member Hart mentioned, need to be adjusted as well. But again, I guess my question goes back to what I asked before. In order for a staff member to get paid by special education funds, they would need to stay with those students all day and just kind of follow them from class to class. Am I misunderstanding something here?
Please answer, Dr. Voorhees.
Thank you, Vice Chair. So yes, sort of, I think would be the answer, Board Member Hymas. The individuals who provide services and supports for students with disabilities who are paid with federal funds need to the lion's share, to spend the lion's share of their time providing services and supports only to students with disabilities. Now, the point that Board Member Moss made about the incidental benefit is to take, for instance, a speech language pathologist who comes into a classroom to provide the services and supports on a couple, let's say there are 3 students in a classroom of 30 students who have very similar articulation errors. Let's say they have a hard time pronouncing an R and a T, very common articulation errors. If they were sitting, the speech language therapist was sitting near them and listening to them and reminding them to pronounce their R's and T's correctly. And another student who was not eligible for special education was sitting next to them and had a question about his or her work, and the SLP helped that student with the work. That would be incidental benefit.
Mm-hmm.
But that SLP cannot sit with that other student and provide half an hour of tutoring or instruction to that non-eligible student. The SLP needs to spend his or her time working with students who are eligible for special education services and providing the exact services that are articulated on each of those students' IEPs. And sometimes you can do that in groups because the services are very similar. And sometimes it, as the law states, has to be individual because the services are not similar. But yes, the individuals who are paid with federal funds should only be providing services to eligible students.
Thank you.
Follow up.
Do you have a follow-up, a quick follow-up?
Just briefly. I'm sorry, but this is a very important topic. Let's go on a different accommodation for an IEP. And again, I'm trying to understand here. A student has an IEP and it says something along the lines of they can get extended time on homework, or use of a calculator in math, something of that nature. Would they still need para to go to those general ed classes with them? Or is this something that the general ed teacher could do if they have, let's say, 3 or 4 kids in their class and they're teaching this class? Do those kids still need somebody from the special education department to be in there? Or is that something where the general ed teacher can say, no, I have this, I can provide extra time and I can get the needs to the student?
Please answer.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I appreciate you bringing up that question, Board Member Hymas, because I think it's really important to make it explicit and that everyone understands the difference between accommodations and services. Students with disabilities who have an IEP have the right to both. Accommodations are rearranging what happens in the classroom to allow the student to access and make progress in the general ed curriculum. Services are instruction. Giving a student a calculator, giving the student extra time, all those types of supports, which is another word in the law, those types of supports are accommodations. And someone who is credentialed does not have to provide those supports. The general education teacher needs to provide those supports, but the general education teacher does not get paid with federal dollars, federal special ed dollars to provide those supports. The services, which is a different part of the IEP, and if you actually look at the form, accommodations are in a different section of the IEP. So you can differentiate not only by, is it instruction or is it engineering the environment, but you can also differentiate by where it sits on the form. Services are reading instruction, behavior instruction, math instruction. Services are specially designed instruction. And those services can be paid for with federal dollars, and the individual who provides them, who is credentialed or trained and supervised by someone who is credentialed, can provide those services. Is that helpful?
Yes, that's helpful. Just one more question. Would this bill then allow the general ed teacher to get paid for offering these supports? Is that what this bill is suggesting?
Please answer. Either Angie or Deputy Superintendent Stallings or Assistant Superintendent Voorhees, please answer.
I'll start, Assistant Superintendent Voorhees again. That is our concern, that this would allow state funds to be used that way. So, and to be honest, I think a bigger concern was one that was brought up previously by another board member, is that if the IEP determined that the least restrictive environment and the placement was in the general education classroom, that the student would then get the calculator and the extra time, the accommodations on the IEP, but would not receive the actual services, the 30 minutes of specially designed, individualized reading instruction, the 20 minutes of specially designed individual behavior instruction, etc. Because the student is in a general education class and it is not articulated that those services need to be provided. And some of the words in IDEA are in excess of.
Thank you. Seeing no other hands, we will continue. Oh, sorry. Okay, we have 2 other hands. We have 5 minutes. We're hoping to leave 15 minutes. I'm hoping at least to leave 15 minutes to talk about budget, since a lot of that seems to be well underway already, and 30 minutes to have motions on legislation where more discussion can ensue once we have motions on the floor. So let's go ahead with Board Member Booth and then Board Member Straight, please.
Vice Chair, if possible, I'd just like to understand, perhaps from Angie or from Leah, what we could do as a board. It's very clear that the educators, the state board, USBE, the local LEAs and charter schools have almost laser sharp focus on what needs to be done. How do we protect them so that they can continue to do what needs to be done for these individual children with their special needs and not be sidetracked by additional hoops that they have to jump through that may in some ways dilute the education we can provide for these children? May I ask that, and is there some response that would be appropriate at this time?
Yes, you may ask, but our choices here are limited only to move to support the bill or move to oppose the bill or move to amend the bill. So those are our only choices in this meeting. Does anyone from our staff want to add to that?
I'll make a statement. It is in some ways a big question. I wonder if I think one of the things that we've talked about just being a concern is that it could set LEAs up for failure by creating separate standards and then somehow LEAs thinking that they are in compliance, and also a potential for, and it's a natural, I think, thing for an LEA to do, but to, instead of looking at the IEP and what services have been recommended or required under that, to look at the language in state code as being more permissive and giving them the false sense that the LEA has the discretion to have the flexibility in the funds somehow trump or supersede what the IEP dictates. So I think the concern is it could set LEAs up for failure and for having additional findings when they, well-meaning, I'm sure, think that they have more flexibility with state funds and therefore can do things that are easier, I don't know if that's the right word, but more in line with the general education program, and then not actually follow the requirements of the IEPs. There's some confusion in the bill about whether the LEA has that authority or the IEP team.
Thank you. Do you have a follow-up, Board Member Booth?
I do, just quickly, Vice Chair, if possible. Then what I'm asking for is staff's recommendation of the three choices: oppose, support, or amend. What should we do to protect what we already have in place to ensure the best education possible for these children?
Okay, thank you. Vice Chair, should I answer? So we have provided feedback to the sponsor, and we could provide some additional lines or recommendations for amendments that then the board could vote to support, if that's helpful. I don't know if we're ready to give you a line-by-line motion today. I will say, just out of fairness to the sponsor, I do believe that he is working on a first substitute or some amendments that may address some of these issues. So at this point, though, I definitely think the bill as is, you wouldn't want to support. It could be that we could bring this back next week with some amendments that the board could consider supporting if you'd like to do that. Obviously, you also have the ability to oppose this version of the bill and then look at a substitute or an amended bill next week and see if that resolved the concerns.
Thank you so
Thank
much. I
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Board Member Straight, and then we're going to be moving into our finance portion of the meeting.
So at what point do we make motions? Is that now or later?
That will be at 1:30. We'll have a hard start at 1:30.
Okay.
So board members will have 30 minutes to make motions and discuss. So we'll go ahead and turn the time to Deputy Superintendent.
Can I still have something. Is that okay?
Oh, so sorry. Yes, please go ahead and ask your question.
So just an overall general statement. As a regular classroom teacher of 30 years, I've seen so much progress in the use of IEPs. It really does empower me as a teacher to know the expectations and to understand how I can help my students. As a young teacher, when I first learned about this, it seemed so intrusive. It seemed so over the top. Well, they come to class, they get the same thing. But over time, I've really come to see the IEP as a shield that helps us as teachers and helps students. And I'm afraid that in my mind, this bill is becoming a little too clear to me that it's trying to solve a problem based on very specific circumstances. I know the intent is good, but I really oppose this bill, and that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you. Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones.
Thanks, Madam Chair, members of the board, Deputy Superintendent of Operations Scott Jones. Draw your attention to item 4.1 on your agenda. This is the status of the legislative session progress to date. An update to you on your fund, what you identified as your funding request, and then specifically drill down on the top 10 priorities. There's several items in the backup. In the interest of time, but also making sure that we're for the standards. If we could actually go to the comparison chart with PEA, the governor, and the request. Perfect. Thank you so much. Whoever's driving, you're awesome, as always. So I do want to take the time and our fiscal analyst, Dale Frost, is available here. I want to, remind everyone of just how awesome he is and how great he is at keeping us updated and coming out of all these different meetings. If you'll look at, the line item type thing. So the way it stands right now is Executive Appropriations Committee is scheduled to meet today. And they do have the PEA chairs, the Public Education Appropriation chairs, respectively, Representative Ellison and Senator Fillmore, on the agenda to present the PEA prioritizations, right? Now, the items in the gray area were already put into the base budget. We've already covered those, the WPU value increase, enrollment growth, enrollment hold harmless, basically 1 through 5. What you're seeing now as an update to you is starting with line number 6, right, is where your USBI, so I'll move left to right. So line number 6, the funding item, for example, early grade professional learning, your priority number 1, how much from the USBE was requested, if the governor requested it or not, and then what the PEA priority is right now. And so their priority that they would present to EAC later today would be ongoing funding at number 2 on their list. Then, I'll just use I won't go through every line item. I'm just wanting to make sure that everybody's familiar with the legend, if you will, here, the way to read this great report that Dell has worked so hard to put together for us. Line number 7, optional enhanced kindergarten, OEK. You identified it as your number 2 priority of your 10 priorities. The amount, the governor also had it as a priority or part of his recommended budget. And it's number 1 as an ongoing priority for PEA to present again later today to EAC. And then you see it cascades further down, like with my items 8, 9. So Dell put it together, addressing what's already been funded in the base, and then items 1 through 10, or your priorities 1 through 10, and how it all fell out by way of the PEA public education's appropriation process. I would like to add too that, and again, subject to the process that now takes place with Executive Appropriations Committee, just once again, the legislature is demonstrating a really high regard and a highly supportive role, if you will, or funding for public education. Given all the circumstances, Utah, we all know, leads the way as far as our economy, things like that, but they're really making a difference again in what they're proposing, again, all subject to the process, to EAC, to fund public education appropriations. So if we could continue down a little bit further, so we have lines 1 through 15, which again encapsulates your priorities 1 through 10. Then you had other requests, and they too are all, as I walk you through this, you can see where they were on your list, right? Or that they were on your list of requests and where they've fallen out with PEA. I also just want to call out, for example, let's look at, what is line number 21 on this sheet, which is the Beverly Taylor Sorensen Arts Learning Program. You requested 4 million, and right now it's on priority number 10 of PEA ongoing of 4 million. There are some differences though. For example, if we jump back up to line number 16 with most, you had requested 7.2 million on the PEA priority list. That again is scheduled to go in front of the EAC today. They have it as number 25 with a lower amount with 4 million. And that's pretty much the way to read through this. If we can scroll a little bit further down to our other pass-through business cases or requests continue. So past line 24. Who's driving? Did we free? Okay, yep, great. So then you can see the other lines coming through here with other requests that you made. So we look at lines 25 through basically 30 where you made requests. You can also see like lines 31 through 33. We didn't make those specific requests. The governor did. You can see whether or not PEA moved them forward, and on all the way down. So if we can continue to scroll, please. We get into the budget or keep going down to the next page, if you will. And the USDB business cases and or requests. I just, wanted to make sure I, identified this as well, and where the USDB requests are on the PEA priority list. You can see ongoing number 6, 7, 9, 8, and 6 for what you had on your list, and that what USDB put forward through you is also on the PEA priority list. Madam Chair, this time, if you just recognize our fiscal analyst, Del Frost, for anything I might have missed, he'll keep it short, just real quick, if there's anything that Del needs to add.
Please, fiscal analyst Frost.
Chair, thank you. Members of the board, Scott did a great job going over the comparison chart. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Just for your clarification, PEA produced 2 lists, one with just ongoing items, one with one-time items. So if you see OT number 7, that simply means that was number 7 on their one-time list, and there are certain items that were in both lists. And so you have both of those. The only other thing I'd point out is line 61. That's the school land trust dollars. Those are not education funds. That was included in a separate motion in their motions document that's being funded separately. But your request, the $275,000 for that request, was included in PEA's documents. It's just in a separate location. Other than that, I would be happy to answer any additional questions.
Okay. Okay, Board Member Lear.
Thank you. And I think this question is either for Deputy Superintendent Jones or Mr. Frost. So I'm looking, and I have actually 2 of them, and if they're short enough, maybe I can ask them together. They're separate ideas though. I'm looking at line 36, which is ELL software for LEAs, and noticing that the public education appropriations put in $3 million. There is also a bill that was recently released on the same topic. I'm reaching for the bill number 338, maybe, by Representative Peterson, which talks about software, ELL software for LEAs. And I just want to make sure my understanding is that from the bill, I want to see if the two are connected, if I'm right about that. And then secondly, if the bill seems to allow LEAs to choose a software that matches the criteria of the bill, so it isn't necessarily a vendor bill. Could either Dale or Scott answer those two questions?
Go ahead,
About-
Dale. Madam Chair.
Chair, may I answer the question?
Sure. Sorry.
Yeah, through the chair, Dale.
Yeah, Chair Member Lear, it's my understanding that is correct. It's House Bill 349, and that it is connected with the 3 million recommended by PEA.
And then the second part of that is does this allow LEAs to choose from multiple vendors, or is there only going to be one vendor that meets the criteria of that bill? Do you know? Does Analyst Frost know that?
Chair, may I answer that question?
Yes.
Chair, Member Lear, that is correct. It's my understanding that this is to move away from the board procuring a set of vendors to allocating the funds and letting them procure the software that meets those 3 criteria, as you said, and that can, I don't believe it's just a single vendor, is my understanding.
Thank you. And I'll come back to my other question. Thanks.
I think that you can ask your other question because I don't see any other hands. Chair, Board
Okay.
Member Lear.
Okay. Shoot.
But we only have 2 minutes.
Oh, line 52, leadership training for principals. It wasn't really a question. It was just a comment that I think that is a wonderful, I'm so excited that this is was added by PEA, and I really hope it provides helpful, necessary services. Thanks. That's all I had.
Okay, looks like we are ready to move into the next portion of our meeting. So I'll now entertain motions on legislation. Oh. How I have a hand up on myself, I do not know. I had 2 hands. I had 1 hand from Board Member Belknap and 1 from Board Member Moss. Looks like yours is down now. Do you still have your hand up, Board Member Belknap?
No, I took my hand down.
Okay, Board Member Moss.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I would like to move that the board indicate support for House Bill number 42, sponsored by Susan Pulsifer with the Senate sponsor of Senator Darren Owens. I'd like to speak to that motion if it is
Thank you,
possible.
please do.
Last week, Member Cannon moved to support one of the 3 bills that came out of a lot of discussions, kind of driven by Representative Pulsifer. That was HB 134.
Can I just break in for a second? I'm sorry. Did we get a second on that bill, and was that placed before the group
I second that.
on that motion?
Hart.
Okay, thank you. I have a motion on the floor to support HB 42, Education Agency Report Process Amendments. We have several hands. I'm assuming these are to speak towards the motion. Let's hear from Board Member Straight.
I took my hand down. I won't be speaking to this one.
Okay, Board Member Belknap.
Yes, I actually think that this requirement is unnecessary with what we've been studying in standards and assessment and what we've been looking at to try and get a process in our own office to work on reporting. It just seems like that having this legislated to us is what we're already working on, and it would leave us more ability to be nimble in how we set up this reporting agency.
I see a hand from Jennifer Thronson. Do you have a comment on this?
It's on a moment ago, so I will wait until you guys get to the EL software support or non-support, if that's okay.
Okay, and I apologize, I don't have your title right in front of me.
Oh, Director of Teaching and Learning, Jennifer Thronson. Thank you.
Amazing Director of Teaching and Learning, Jennifer. Please, Board Member Moss.
I'm sorry, were others wanting to speak? I'm happy to come back to me if others have been heard. Just me?
Your hand
Okay.
is up right now currently.
If I'm the only one up, okay, I just didn't want to hog all the time. I speak in support because I think this is a fairly minimal set of requirements, which may overlap, as Vice Chair Belknap indicated, with work that's already done. But I think it would be useful to us to indicate our support for what the legislature is trying to do in this space. The elements that they would ask us to consider about a proposed report moving forward, as opposed to looking backward. This is a forward-looking requirement that we look at the cost to an LEA, which I don't think is too difficult. I think it's something that's, already required as a fiscal impact when you're looking at a legislative bill. This is for reports that are not mandated by federal law or Utah code, but rather reports that we generate ourselves at the board level. And so for those reports, I think this would simply impose a requirement that we do something similar to a fiscal note that would attach to most bills coming out of the legislature, that we would have to look at the estimated cost to an LEA, the estimated time to the LEA to prepare the report, and any disproportionate impact the report might have on an LEA because of the LEA's size, location, or other factors. So I understand that we've already been looking at this internally. I think these are perhaps minimal requirements for us to look at and are just a matter of fairness to the LEAs before we generate something and pass it on to them. So that's why I would recommend we indicate support for what Representative Pulsipher is attempting to do.
Okay, thank you. Chair Huntsman.
Thank you. With this bill, is there a fiscal impact on this? Is there more money coming to us if we support this? We're in the same boat. If we're wanting to move on this, why don't they fund us so that when we have a request for information or we need to make an informed decision on something and they're forcing us to do this with legislation, are they putting money with it?
Is there someone who could answer this question? Deputy Superintendent Stallings?
Yes, I'd be happy to, Vice Chair. Yes, currently the fiscal note shows a 14,200 ongoing fiscal impact. So I believe that if they pass the bill, that they would hopefully fund the 14,200, it looks like.
Can I do a follow-up?
Please.
You don't, can somebody share how many hours possibly of support that money will pay for in helping us with being in compliance with this particular ask? I view this somewhat punitive. It's supposed to discourage us from asking for a report or additional information. Because it will cost, not only does it cost them to respond, and I thought we kind of have some oversight, I thought, over public education, and I don't think we're asking for the moon when we ask certain questions, but this is putting a significant financial burden. And the other piece is to go through the exercise to try to figure out what that's going to cost them. That analysis is going to slow progress down on trying to get information from an LEA. So I'm curious. So I guess to my first question, Vice Chair, if staff could ask how many hours of help $14,000 would give us.
Yes, Deputy Superintendent Stallings or Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones could answer that question, and then hopefully the hands up that are up are wanting to speak to this motion. Please, Deputy Superintendent Stallings.
And it could be that this question is better answered by Dale Frost, because I believe he would be able to find the information that we submitted. And I just wanted to correct what I stated on the 14,200. I was speaking to the first substitute, and I apologize. The bill HB 42 only shows a $13,000 ongoing impact versus the first sub, just for your information, adds 2 more reports to be repealed. So if somebody, I don't know if Dale or Scott, do either of you know how many hours that we calculated? I believe that we may have calculated more hours and a higher impact than is reflected in the fiscal note, but I could be wrong.
Fiscal Analyst Frost, can you answer that question? Is this what we submitted? And how much time did that money buy?
Great question. I'm looking into it right now. One of the parts is this is one of 3 different bills and that relate to the same thing. And that's what I'm trying to see what was said. And the other part that offsets this is that bill, House Bill 42, eliminates certain reports. So there are some savings on one end and there are additional things on the other end. So I'd have to look into it a little more to get you an exact answer. I apologize.
Okay, thank you. Let's go with Board Member Hanson. Trying to keep track of who raised your hand first, and I apologize because every now and then my screen rotates your pictures really quickly like a disco ball. So you're all kind of dancing in and out, but Scott Hanson.
If you're watching me dance, I feel for you. I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Board Member Belknap said. We do have an effort ongoing right now. We're looking at all the requirements, both requirements that are in legislation, requirements from the state school board, and federal requirements, and trying to figure out how to streamline those. Creating another report and having us go back to the legislature with that. I'm not sure that that does anything to speed things up. And if there's not enough money to pay for that report, then certainly it's just a detrimental effort. I don't know that this bill does anything to enhance or help us with what we're already doing. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Thank you, Board Member Earl.
I guess maybe I don't understand that full impact then, because I guess I'm just seeing this as an estimate of the time that it would take LEAs, an estimate of the cost associated with it. And so I'm looking at it more as as part of the process, or part of the thought behind certain reports, and making sure that we're not adding more work. And that may be some additional work on our end to try to provide. Anyways, so I guess I'm trying to understand maybe that full impact for our staff.
Thank you. Board Member Hart.
I guess it's really going along with what Board Member Earl said. This is just asking for some thought put into what the end is the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak. And we have to answer those hard questions for LEAs. There hasn't been a single issue that has come before the board that we have not heard about how difficult it is for our LEAs to be precise and get us the information that we're asking for, because we're being asked for so much. We're asking so many different pieces, parts. It's a reasonable part of the process of making a decision about moving forward with something by asking what the impact would be for the LEA. And we do need to be concerned about the quality of the data coming to the board because, we hear it with school fees, we hear it with all kinds of reports that we're not necessarily providing the resources for those LEAs to give us good information. Those are very important questions to ask as part of the process. And I do believe that they need to be put into code so that it's just a natural part of the process. I do understand that we're moving in that space, but too easy to let that slide when we deem something very, very important or what have you. I think this just puts some guardrails around what we're asking LEAs to do, and we are making sure that they have the resources, the time, the space needed to do what we're asking them to do in a high quality way.
Thank you. Last hand looks like Board Member Lear.
Thank you. I have a slightly different concern. I very much support limiting the information that the board is asking for from LEAs and doing something meaningful in that direction. I think that's a great effort. My concern is that I've said several times, most of the LEA generated reports are because the legislature wants something from the board that the board can't provide without getting individualized data from 160 plus LEAs. So I don't want to put the board in a position of not being able to generate accurate information because the legislature has asked the board for information. So I would completely support this if there was a companion section that was almost identical about the legislature analyzing the impact on the board to research and gather information from LEAs, because I think this is a mutual problem. And I don't like feeling like the board is the bad guy, so to speak. And I don't want to make it too pejorative, but I don't want the board to be seeming to be the bad guy in generating reports and not acknowledge that the reports that are coming from as required from the board are because the board needs to report to the state very often or to the federal government sometimes. So I think either that caveat, unless it's required by the legislature, in which case our analysis is waived, or unless it is required by the federal government, in which case our analysis is waived. So that's my reservation about supporting this bill, is I want all parties asking for data to jointly work on this. And I feel like this is pointed at the board. Thanks.
Thank you. Board Member Moss.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I know there are probably other motions. I would just point out that another bill, 300, asks the board to consider the existing reports and ask a number of questions. One of those questions is the impact on the state board of fulfilling statutory requirements from the legislature, as well as the impact on the LEAs. And that bill invites the state board to recommend legislation to the legislature. So I do see that companion bill, and I was going to move on that one separately, but I do see that as an invitation to discuss the impact that comes from the state legislature on us and everybody else, as well as the impact of an LEA on what we decide to do. So I don't know how that affects the view of this particular bill, but I do think it's part of the broader context of what Representative Pulsford is trying to address.
Thank you. We have
Chair, could I answer
yes, thank
the
you.
question about fiscal impacts?
Yes, thank you. Fiscal impacts, Frost.
Great. Chair Huntsman, members. So the $13,000 ongoing would pay for approximately 200 hours of time for an education specialist. That's total cost. And then I do, member Moss mentioned House Bill 300, and the fiscal note for that is 39,000 one time to go through and analyze the existing statutes and the reporting requirements associated with those. Hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. We have a motion on the floor that the board support HB 42. All those, did I get that number right? I think it is. All those who are in favor, I'm going to take a roll call vote because the checks still are not staying up. So board member or Vice Chair Belknap?
No.
Board member Booth?
Yes.
Did board member Janet Cannon ever arrive?
She did, and she's right here. She's been here. I've been here since about 12:05, thanks.
Oh, so sorry. Thank you. Are you a yes
My
or
vote
no?
is no, Vice Chair.
Board member Natalie Klein?
Yes.
Board member Jenny Earl?
Yes.
Board member Scott Hansen?
No.
Board member Molly Hart?
Yes.
Board member Mark Huntsman?
No.
Board member Matt Hymas?
Yes.
Board member Carol Lear?
No.
Board member James Moss?
Yes.
Board member Kristen Norton?
No.
Board member Brent Straight? Board member Brent Straight?
Unmute, sorry. No.
That motion fails. Okay. Board member Straight?
Yes, thank you. I would like to make the motion that we oppose Senate Bill 131 and would like to speak to that motion.
Yes, please do.
Second.
And you need to place that motion, please.
We have a motion on the floor and a second that the board opposes SB 131, Public Education Building Standards and Process. Go ahead and speak to the motion.
So I've been given lots of feedback on this particular bill. It's one that's very important in regards to local control. As I've thought about it and I've read and I looked at the position of the charter schools, I could actually see a benefit for this type of a bill for them. But when it comes to the districts that I represent, they elect board members. They're elected by the general population. They serve a very specific group of people. And when they propose a bond for these schools, those bonds are not paid by all residents in the state. They are paid by the people who live in that geographical region. It's local money. It's voted by local communities and by voters who keep those board members accountable for the cost of those buildings. Secondarily, and just as important, I've heard people refer to these new high schools specifically, but all schools in general, that these are Taj Mahals. I don't know if anyone has visited one of our newer high schools, which is Farmington High School. But within that school, they have a very specific learning model that they are trying to promote. Days of lining 32 desks up in a room where a teacher talks to the students is not the direction the education's going, but local control will determine not only the curriculum, when we talk about local control so much, but they determine what those schools will look like. Schools are an important part of the community, and we need to allow that flexibility for our local leaders who are elected. I would like to see, however, a further look at clear standards being put in place for charter schools, and there might be some efficiencies that we might gain from this bill in regards to charter schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Board Member Norton.
Yes, I like that word flexibility that Board Member Straight just talked about. The area that I represent is a high growth area, and it has been a high growth area for a long time. And Utah is going to see that as, you know, this pandemic continues, because people are flocking here just in huge numbers, and we're going to be building schools. You know, in talking with our districts here, they said we can't even make a 3-year plan because it changes so frequently with where people are coming and the huge numbers we're seeing. But it's also, I'm afraid, might take away some of their flexibility with their building processes. I know that they have worked very hard. They've been across the country looking at building processes and finding ways to cut costs, but yet build buildings that will last a long time. And, you know, they're doing a great job. They're being honored by the Utah Taxpayers Association for the way that they're building buildings. I just worry that taking that away from our LEAs, that incentive to keep going and instead just, you know, have to follow a generalized footprint would not be in the best interest for our taxpayer dollars or our school districts and LEAs.
Thank you. Chair Huntsman.
Thank you. You're doing awesome, Vice Chair Davis. A concern I have with this bill is that all of a sudden we just got done talking about forms and burden and stuff on LEAs, and this basically puts us, would be establishing at USBE something similar to a building department, you know, with plan review or setting standards, and it actually it's a distraction from what we're really supposed to be about, which is public education. And so it definitely is a step away from those local control issues, but it just adds another to do and another thing. And right now there's plenty of experts out there that are keeping up with building standards and codes and good processes of nice buildings going up. And then I also appreciate the local control comments that was before us, but I don't think we're ready to get into the building business up here at USBE.
So, oops, sorry.
Thank you, Board Member Earl.
Yeah, our local district recently went through this process of building 2 buildings. That's not much, but in a rural area, that's quite a bit. And I don't know if this is the case everywhere, but they very much had the public part of that as part of dialogue, what they wanted, what they didn't want. And so it was a very much a local decision, both with the energy efficiency of it, as well as the cost of it associated with the bond. They allowed the public to come to several meetings, put their input. So I guess what I'm saying is I think it is key that that's left flexible for those local districts and the local taxpayers to make those key decisions.
Thank you. Board Member Hanson.
Here we go. There we go. I'll be brief, but I think the funding mechanism has to dictate where the control is. And if the funding is local, then the control should be local. If somehow we wanted to shift the funding to be a more centralized thing, or we were distributing resources that way, which would be a big shift, then I think that this may have some merit where we could have kind of a cookie cutter approach and build schools that were a lot more similar. But with the current funding, I think the local control has to dictate local control of the funding and of the architecture, the building design.
Thank you. Seeing no other hands. Oh, okay. Seeing no other hands, I'll go ahead and take a roll call vote. We have a motion on the table that the board oppose SB 131, Public Education Building Standards and Process. Vice Chair Belknap,
Yes.
Board Member Booth,
Yes.
Board Member Cannon,
I favor opposition.
Board Member Klein,
No.
Board Member Earl,
I'm in opposition to this, so no.
No, yes.
sorry, did you say something else, Board Member Earl?
No.
You're a no. Board Member Hanson,
Just so I'm clear, this vote is to oppose SB 131, is that right? So a positive vote is in opposition to the bill.
May
And
I
vote yes.
Okay.
I would need to correct myself. I'm sorry. I am thinking the opposite of the opposite here.
Okay, you're a yes.
The motion is to oppose, so I'd need to say yes. So yes.
Okay, Board Member Hart,
Yes, I oppose
Okay.
SB
Chair
131.
Would need to. Not.
Chair Huntsman,
Yes.
Board Member Hymus,
Yes.
Board Member Lear,
Yes.
Board Member Moss,
Yes.
Board Member Norton,
Yes.
Board Member Straight.
Yes.
That motion passes with all in favor except Board Member.
I actually was confused as well, so I would be a yes, I oppose this.
Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Thank you.
I'm sorry, can I just get a clarification? So was Member Cannon in favor or opposed?
She was in favor.
Okay, of the motion, okay.
To my understanding, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, the motion passed unanimously.
I see it that way. That's what Chair Huntsman.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all for coming today. I appreciate your patience with me as I chaired my first full board meeting, and I'm grateful for all of you, and we will see you next time. This meeting is adjourned.